Good afternoon. I am Kayla Barrett, Deputy Director of the Georgia Archives. Welcome to the Georgia Archives Records Management Day presentation. Quick! A disaster is coming. Where are your records? Are they safe? By Georgia Archives Director of Records Management, Christine Garrett. Christine came to the Georgia Archives in September 2014 from the Alabama Department of Archives and History. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in History with a minor in Classical Civilization from Randolph-Macon Women's College and her Master of Arts degree in History with a concentration in Archives from Auburn University. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Kayla. As Kayla said, my name is Christine Garrett, and I oversee the Records Management Program here at the Georgia Archives, which includes the State Records Program, the Local Government Records Program, Electronic Records, and the State Records Center. My talk today will cover the critical area of records management, one critical area of records management that doesn't just apply to government records, but it applies to everybody's records, and that is disaster planning. And it's for all types. It's for businesses, volunteer organizations, and households. I chose to focus on this topic because I believe disaster planning is something that we easily forget during our day-to-day lives, and we don't think about it until an actual disaster occurs, and by then it's too late. We're all stressed out trying to figure things out. So planning ahead is important, and being reminded of disasters and our needs to protect our records is key. Before I get started, I just want you to imagine this scenario. There's a fire such as this one that happened near Gatlinburg in 2016, heading towards your house. Officials say that you have 30 minutes to get yourselves out, and what are you taking with you? You only have 30 minutes. You know you're going to come home, and most likely everything will be gone. So whatever's in your car is what you save. What are you taking? You might want to take some objects. Are you going to include records? How long will it take you to gather those objects and records? Do you know where they are? How long will it take for you to, like I said, to gather these up? I ask these questions because prioritizing what you want to save and planning ahead are two very important parts of disaster planning. The more you plan ahead, the less likely you will be stressed and grab the wrong thing, and the more able you'll be to protect the records that you will need to respond to and recover from the disaster. Sometimes you will have time to prepare for a disaster. For example, I'm from Florida originally, and we get hurricanes, and you have a couple of days notice to pack up and prepare, and get your house prepared and evacuate. But oftentimes disasters don't give you a warning. And so you need to be prepared to react immediately. And the more you plan ahead, the less likely the stress that comes from that disaster is going to affect your ability to save things. And the scenario I mentioned about getting out quickly is one that has occurred in California, Florida, and elsewhere. People have had little advance notice, and sometimes because they're not prepared, they have just grabbed their pets and themselves and left. And they didn't even have time to grab wallets or purses. It's whatever records were in their car was what they went to go on. And if you think about what's in your car, try imagining rebuilding your life based on that. You might have your car tag registration, you might have an insurance card, but you might not have a photo ID. You might not have anything that can really help you aside from your car information. So you really want to plan ahead. So this is my basic agenda for today. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about potential disasters so that you can think ahead of what kind of things you might want to keep in mind that could affect your records, and then identifying those important records that are necessary to help you respond to a disaster, recover from a disaster, and get your life back on track. During some of those talks, I'll mention a little bit about some mitigation strategies, but I will cover them after that as well. And then very briefly, one quick slide about recovery strategies. If you're interested in learning more about mitigation and recovery, that's actually another talk we can give. Just let us know if you're interested in it. So starting off with common disasters. So on the screen, you see some common disasters we are likely to see here in Georgia. Of course, there are many disasters that can come to mind, and one of the first ones that comes to my mind is fire. We already saw the fire from Gatlinburg. That was a wildfire, so you can have a wildfire or a house fire. Now, when we think of wildfires, we often think of them in California, out west, but they happen here too. Not just a few years ago, we had fires up in North Georgia and in South Georgia in the Okefenokee Swamp. There are things that can happen. You can have a lightning strike. If it's very dry out, one lightning strike can set off a fire. An unextinguished cigarette butt, a fire that somebody started and left behind or didn't totally extinguish. All these can grow into wildfires if not caught in time. I lived in a neighborhood where we had a kid who, for whatever reason, decided to go in the woods behind our neighborhood and set a leaf on fire. And it was during the dry season. We had a burn ban going at the time, and his fire, one leaf fire, turned into a fire that was about 2 football fields in size. Luckily, he had a friend with him who ran to get help, but the fire department had trouble getting to the fire because it was in the woods. So they had to keep circling until they could get back there. Meanwhile, the fire was growing, and because it was windy, it was sending ashes and embers towards the houses, and they were landing like a foot away from our homes, even though the fire itself was about a quarter-mile away. Luckily, it was able to be extinguished before it got near us, but it could have quickly turned into something else, because even that one little ash ember can start a bigger fire. We saw this recently in South Africa, where they had fires in the mountains, and a few embers came down and set a university library on fire, and they lost a lot of unique, important historical collections. So you really have to be careful when you have wildfires because they spread rapidly. You also have house fires. And the way our houses are built today and the stuff inside, it means the houses burn a whole lot quicker than they used to. And we have to be prepared to protect ourselves and respond to that. Some of the top causes are kitchen fires. People will put something in the oven at night because they're trying to clean up, and they just stick it in there and they forget that it's in there, turn the oven on the next day, and it catches fire because they don't realize that something's in there. Or they turn a burner on to heat something up, on the burner, but they turn on the wrong burner. And the burner they turn on has something on top of it that catches fire. You have electrical fires. Dryers are also a big danger. And like I said, I'll talk about mitigation sometimes throughout this. And one of the things to do is to not leave things in the kitchen on without making sure that they are what you think is, there's nothing in the oven, there's the right burner, no oil is spilling, and don't leave your house with major appliances like a dryer or a dishwasher running. Floods are a very common disaster as well. They can occur from prolonged rain or deluges. If it keeps raining and raining, the ground gets saturated and cannot take in more water. And if it rains so rapidly that the water cannot go through the ground either. And then the water rises, and it can rise into your home. It turns roadways into rivers, and the flood can obviously affect your records and your home. Your paper will quickly absorb the water. You need to respond quickly to this. Water is in all types of disasters, as we're going to see as I cover the next few ones. Tornadoes affect our area, generally in spring and fall as the seasons change. We saw this past Easter, the city of Noonan was hit. All the other locations in the state have been affected as well. The top photo on the screen comes from the 2011 tornado outbreak in Alabama. It's from Coleman, Alabama. I took the photo. I have no clue if that was supposed to be a house or a business. There's a laundry basket, so I think it was a house. But imagine if this was your house and you have no records, you don't have, all your records are there, and you're now told to start over. It'd be very difficult. Now, the filing cabinet, you can clearly see a filing cabinet in the middle of the screen, just in the center of the screen, a little lower, but it could have been looted before the family got back in time, because people will come and loot things and steal. So they have to have the records to respond and move on from this. As we've learned recently in the past few years, we are not immune to hurricanes here in Georgia. We had Irma that affected all the way up to Atlanta. We had tropical storm warnings, but that wasn't the first time that a storm has caused problems. We've had the remnants of Dennis, Katrina, Opal, and other storms come through. And since then, other storms have come through. Not too long ago, South Georgia was affected by Hurricane Michael, I believe it was called, and left a whole lot of damage as a Category 4. And hurricanes can bring tornadoes with them, as well as just like strong storms bring tornadoes. And strong storms themselves can cause problems. They can have up to 60-mile-an-hour winds, and that can send trees crashing into your house, ruining your roof, allowing leaks. They can crash into your vehicles, and you need to get your information on your vehicle, which might be inside your vehicle. Other disasters include winter ice storms, which are a little bit more rare here than these other types of disasters, but they do happen. And unlike places up north, our infrastructure and buildings just are not designed to handle them as much as maybe a place in Massachusetts, because we don't go weeks being below freezing. So when we do hit that freezing point and have ice storms, or snowstorms, our pipes can burst and other problems can occur. During a winter storm not too long ago, there were 3 houses in my neighborhood that had their pipes all burst. 2 of them were able to take care of them very quickly, but one was in an empty home. The owner had passed away a few months prior, and her family had not been able to get in and take care of, completing her estate and going through things and all that. And then they didn't come in for another 3 months after this had happened. And so you can imagine what they found when they got there, because mold and mildew form within 48 hours. And you can imagine 3 months, it was really gross. They basically had to gut the whole house. If there's anything in the house that they wanted, it was gone. So you really, really want to respond quickly to water problems, because otherwise you'll lose things. You can have leaking and broken pipes, which can damage records. And we often think of a major pipe burst being the worst scenario between a minor or major break in your water pipes. But a small leak can be bigger, because you might have that small leak where your records are, and you might have your records stored in a location you don't go very often. And the leak might be small enough where you really don't notice it, and you sketch your water bill, and you say, oh, well, maybe I took a couple extra long showers, or I washed laundry, or you washed the car more. And then by the time you realize there's a leak somewhere and you find it, your records are now moldy, mildewy, and you've got probably have house damage as well. And a bigger disaster than a major leak, because a major leak you're going to find very quickly, but it still can cause problems. There's other sources of water. One that can be a problem is your air conditioning unit. If it's in the attic and you have your drip pan gets overflowing and starts dripping, you might not go in your attic very often, and you might not realize there's a problem as the water leaks into this down to the ceiling below, and you might not see that problem until you start noticing stains on the ceiling, or the ceiling itself falls in. And finally, on this slide, you can see at the bottom, you can see a picture of some structural damage. Unfortunately, a couple months ago, we saw what happened in Surfside near Miami when a condo collapsed and caused a lot of death and heartache. And they had to bring down the rest of the condo because it was unsafe. People were not allowed to go back and get their stuff. and they lost their records there too. And so now they don't have anything, and they might not have access to records to help them start rebuilding. And so even though this picture doesn't look like a major problem, and it's not going to cause that building to collapse, it still allows things like pests and water and other little minor issues to get into that building. Some more disasters. Going off the structural damage, the second one says pests, and pests can be a big problem. Like with paper records, you have rodents and insects that love to nest in or eat your records, and then they leave their droppings there, and those can be very hazardous to your health, and you might lose your records because they're now a hazard, they're a health hazard. Another type of pest can be a human, because people like to steal things, so you have to be careful of theft. And then going back to the top, you have poor climate control. Each type of media that your record is on, whether it's a photograph, it's on paper, it's on, you know, some type of electronic media, every single one of those formats, they need a certain environment to stay stable, because they're made up of elements that break up over time. Paper is very acidic. It is slowly breaking down over time. And then the chemicals that make up paper or make up photographs are breaking down. So they need to be in humidity and temperatures to slow that breakage down. And technically the best range is 65 to 75 degrees and 45 to 55% humidity. And if you're in Georgia, you're probably laughing, because there's no way you can keep your house at that. And the idea is to keep it consistent, because it is more damaging to records to go through swings, because if you think about a sidewalk outside that has gone through winter and summer, and it eventually gets cracks in it because it's expanded and contracted, that happens with your paper. The fibers that make up your paper will expand and contract, and they eventually break. If it's sitting outside, the temperature and the humidity sitting outside that range, but sitting consistently, it's causing less expansion and contraction. But you don't want it too cold or too dry, because it causes your records to become brittle. And too humid or too hot, you can get mold and mildew. And today's world is very technical. We're moving more and more to having a lot of records online or on electronic devices. And while that's convenient for us, it has increased the number of threats that can happen. One of the first is technological obsolescence, and that's when the software or hardware that your computer or your records are in is no longer compatible with what the current systems you have are. So you see on the screen, you can see in the top picture, you see an 8-inch floppy, 5 1/4-inch floppy, and a 3 1/2-inch floppy. If you have records on these, you might not be able to access them because you don't have that drive at home. If you can't access them, you don't have them. Now, there are companies out there that do provide a service that can help get the records off, but you might still have issues because you might not have software to go back that far. I worked on a project a few years ago that had records on floppies, and the 3-inch, 3 1/2-inch, and I had to use an old computer to access the floppies. And then luckily that old computer had Windows 97, Word 97 on it, because the Word program or the Microsoft program actually predated 95, and our current systems do not go back that far. And this can be a problem with records that you really need to prove are authentic, because if you open up these older documents in Word, it can put all that extra gibberish and nonsense in it because it doesn't have the right formatting, the right coding or whatever. And then there are people can cause that, bring that into question about, is this truly authentic? So you really have to be careful about making sure things are kept up and migrated to newer software. Then you have media degradation, and that occurs when the media, the storage media, breaks down. This you can see with, if you kept a CD in a car for too long, you might notice it starts skipping because the heat has broken down the chemicals. And it's one thing if that's, you know, a CD from maybe a popular singer you like, because you can go replace that CD. If it's the only records or the only place your records are, you've lost your records because it's really hard to recover them in that instance. There's a lot of towns that in cities and locations that when we started turning around to changing over to the 21st century, started having events, historical events and documentation about, you know, the city in the 20th century, or sometimes they'll do 75th anniversary or something. And they had a mini dark age from the 1980s occur because a lot of their stuff was on VHS tapes, and those VHS tapes had degraded to the point where they couldn't go back and use them. So that was where a lot of their film came from, a lot of their records were from. When they wanted to show them, they couldn't because they were lost. We then have cybercrime, and this is a huge problem. We hear it in the news all the time. We'll hear major companies will break down, will get hacked. We had Colonial Pipeline and some others recently. They love to hack government agencies and hospitals because information is money. And there's other reasons they hack, but you know, hack into systems, but they're really looking for your information. And one place they will look is individuals, because individuals tend to have less security on their systems than a major corporation, because the major corporation has an IT staff that, you know, is paid to stay ahead of this stuff. So I could not find a good photo of a person hacking into a computer, because a person hunched over like that over a computer, maybe the person was just looking closely. I mean, you can't really tell. So I have a little humor to add to this. This picture of cybercrime. This is my cat, Delilah, looking at a computer. And at the time, Delilah was very interested, or at one time she was very interested in a YouTube video. She was fascinated. She heard it, the music port start, and she'd come running. Well, one day I had turned on the computer and turned on Netflix. Then I paused it. And I came back and she was in front of the computer, staring very intently at the computer. When I turned Netflix back on, the video part resumed, but the audio was her favorite YouTube audio. And I was like, oh, I didn't have YouTube open. I've only gone on to Netflix via the Netflix app. Our computer was set up so that nothing was saved. Our passwords, you know, history was deleted. We didn't have passwords saved. We never even used the browser she was on. So when you open it up, you didn't have direct access to YouTube from it. But there she was on her favorite video. And while that's cute, oh, look, the cat figured out how to get to her favorite video. It's not so cute if this was not a cat, but this was a person using their computer to get into your computer. I've had this happen where people have hacked into my computer and taken over control. I've had people hack into my Wi-Fi and they have downloaded things onto my Wi-Fi using my Wi-Fi that I get notices about. I'm like, I didn't download it. There was a couple, 10 years ago or so, I don't know how the information got put on their computer, and I won't say what it is because it's a very sensitive topic, but it was put on their computer, and so very legal to have that, and people, the police department traced it to them being on their computer, and they were arrested for having this very illegal stuff on their computer, and they didn't even put it there. So you have to be very careful with cybercrime, because sometimes they're not just coming in to take your records and your information, but they may be coming in to use your computer and store things on your computer for activities you don't want them doing that for, not that you want them on your computer anyways. You also can have power surges, and that can just affect, fry your system. You got to be careful with those. That's the types of disasters that you can have happen. There are many, many others. I could spend a long time going through those, but it's more important that you know of the big ones that are likely to happen. And if you plan for those, then you're going to be more likely to be ready for the unexpected ones. Now we're going to move on to another big part of this presentation, and those are, it's called essential records. And these are the records that you really need to protect. You have a lot of records in your house. You have paper receipts or receipts. You have invoices, doctor's appointments, medical notices, just a wide variety of things. When a disaster occurs, you're not going to want to worry so much about all of your records. There are going to be ones you really want to focus on, and these are those that you want to make sure nothing happens to. You don't want to have, say, that scenario where you evacuate and you grab a box that you think it's important records, and you realize it was a box of receipts from like 10 years ago from the grocery store or something, and you meant to grab your box that had birth certificates, marriage license, and medical records. So you want to make sure you have these records. So the first ones are necessary to respond to or recover from a disaster. So if a disaster is imminent or happening, you may need certain records to help you deal with that situation. If you have a disaster heading towards you, you have a hurricane coming, you're going to want to know the evacuation routes and shelter information. You want to have more than one evacuation route because something could occur that causes your route that you would go to be closed. As I said, I'm from Florida. In 2004, the west coast of Florida was hit by a major storm, major hurricane, Category 4, and then a month later, the East Coast was hit by a Category 3, I believe. Well, when you're on the East Coast, because that's where I'm from, your evacuation routes are either going to the West Coast, going to Orlando, or heading north. Well, because the West Coast had been hit by a hurricane, that meant a lot of the shelters that would have normally been opened or hotels that would normally be available going that way were not available because they were where the evacuees from that hurricane where they actually hit, and where responders were and volunteers were to help. So suddenly need to find a different route, but luckily people had a different route. You want to know if you need a medical shelter or a pet shelter, because not everyone provides all those specialties that you may need. You need to know which ones you're heading to. You want identification records. Definitely have some kind of government issued record with your photo and your address. Because if you're evacuating and you go to a shelter, you're going to need to prove that you're from the evacuation zone, because they don't want to let anybody just stay there. They want to make sure that they're truly serving those who need to come. They have a small amount of space. They can't just take everybody. If you go to a hotel and you have your photo ID, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes there are hotels that will cut their rates. They might let you keep your pets there without fees, or if they usually don't allow pets, they might allow pets, to give you a place to go to. So being able to prove that you're from there is helpful. And sometimes local businesses that know people are coming in will help as well, so you want to be able to prove it. And then when you go back, at first, if it's a major disaster, the first group going in are the first responders going in, making sure people are okay, trying to rescue people that did not leave. You have people coming in and making sure the situation is safe for people to return, making sure there's no down power lines or any kind of dangers, and then they're going to start letting residents in. Well, you need to prove that you're a resident of that area to get in. And an identification card that's government issued is the best way to identify yourself anyways. When my daughter turned 15, I was trying to look into getting her driver's permit. You know, what kind of documentation would I need? And one of them was a photo ID. And the problem is my daughter's adopted, and I didn't have any kind of real photo ID of her. The only one I had, the closest thing I had, was a yearbook from when she was like 11. Well, that's not going to count. A yearbook is not a government issued identification. They don't take a yearbook. And so they were, the one I was working with, the law enforcement agency I was working with, like, you can't do that. And we were getting worried, because how is she going to get a license? How is she going to get an ID? Because once she hit 18, if she didn't get that, it's really, really hard to get an adult to get an ID. So you really need something for a teenager, so it helps. Because, you know, as an adult, you can't say, here are my parents. They can say, I'm an adult and this is me. A teenager, you can do that with. Fortunately, we were able to get one eventually, but it was a little worrisome for a bit. You want to have your insurance records, of course. The quicker you can get in contact with insurance, the better off you are, especially if it's a major disaster. You're going to have a lot of people calling in, and you want to, the sooner you can contact your insurance, the better, because they can respond to you quicker. Same thing with repairmen, because everybody's calling. The quicker you get your name in there and on the list, the faster we responded, because you have everybody calling them. If you're looking for that information, people are already on the phone calling. So it's going to be a longer time for people to come back to you. You want contact information for government agencies. I remember when the tornadoes hit, I think the 2011 tornadoes, my grandparents were in an area that was affected, and we couldn't get through to them because their phones were down. And we were able to find the information on one of the local, I think it was a courthouse, and they were able to send somebody out and let us know if they were safe or not. So just us, the family, being in contact, but contacting government agencies to know if you're allowed back in. And then in Georgia, you can contact the Professional Licensing Board of the Secretary of State and other licensing boards to ensure that people who just randomly show up on your property and say, hey, I want to help you fix your house. I see, I'm just in town to help. That you can check that they are truly licensed, because there are unfortunately people who are scammers that like to come in and use a hurricane or a major disaster to scam people, and people are in need of getting their places fixed, so they go for it. But the licensing board will be able to help you identify people who are truly licensed, because if you have work done by somebody who's not licensed, that can cause insurance problems and other problems further down the road. You want your records that protect your health, safety, property, and rights. Do not assume that a business or government entity will have your records, particularly if you have a catastrophic disaster. Growing up, I had a neighbor who was from England, and he was certified to be, or licensed an architect there, and his records were kept in London in one building. There's only one file, and in the 1940s, 1940-41, the Blitz happened. He lost his records. He had no way to prove that he was an architect. So when he moved to the United States, he did not become an architect because he could not prove he was licensed. So, because there weren't all those copies back then. Now we have copies now, but still, you want your copies with you, because even if those agencies and companies don't lose your records, which if they probably hopefully have plans, you still have people calling in trying to get those records. So the stuff that you have, if you have your records and your copies of your records, and you don't have to call and wait in line, again, same thing with insurance, it helps, because it's just a little bit quicker to get your life back in order. But these are definitely records you want. Medical records. If you have prescriptions or you need some kind of treatment and you can't get back home, or something happens, say you evacuate and you forget to get one of your prescriptions, you can have your medical records, and that will help you get your prescriptions refilled. Because there's definitely some medical situations you don't want to be without your prescriptions. Your licensing, your birth certificates, we had to prove who you are, and all these, what property you own. As you can see, these are those types of records. And do not forget your pets. So your pets have rights too, and if you don't take care of their records, they might have to go to the vet more and get extra shots, because say you evacuate with your cats or your dogs or whatever pets, and your vet's office is destroyed, or you just don't go back or whatever, and you have to go to a new vet. Well, if you go to a new vet and you don't have any medical records on your pet, they're going to assume that your pet has not been vaccinated, and they will start the regimen all over again. And if you've had pets before, you know that there's the first round, there's a booster shot and all that. So your pets have a right not to get given shots, extra shots. And I can tell you, just looking at some of these cats on the screen, they're not all with me anymore, but they have at some point lived with me. I can tell you, if my vets would say 3 of them, the white and orange, the calico, and the one in the tuxedo in the middle on the bottom, they don't want to give them extra shots. They were not pleasant to give shots to. The little itty bitty tuxedo had 3 legs, but when you gave her shots, she suddenly had 6 and just went berserk. She needed 2 or 3 people to give her shots. So you don't also want to pay that extra money. If you're going to a shelter, you need to be able to prove that they're healthy. So the tuxedo in the bottom corner, he was a stray that we took care of and eventually moved in with my daughter when she moved out. He had FIV, so he might not be able to go into a shelter. You want photos of your animals, you want them microchipped. No matter how much precaution you take to ensure you don't lose your pet, they can escape. You can have a tornado and they go running because they're afraid when if the house gets damaged, they might run, and how do you get your pet back? Somebody might find them and be like, well, we can't identify this person's pet, we'll keep them, or they'll turn them over to the shelter and you don't know where they are. So you want to microchip, you want to keep your microchip up to date. People move around, people change phone numbers. And you just want to keep also your pet's needs in mind, because the one that zoomed in, he's a very nervous cat. He would not do well in a shelter, so I have to know where I can take him that he would not be freaked out. And just a side note about the Medicison, the white and orange one and the calico both had diabetes. So they took insulin, which came from one of our types of pharmacies. So I would have to have that medication, the prescription with me for that, but also needed proof of that because just like humans, you gave it through shots. So I need to be able to prove why I had syringes with me when I didn't have any disease that would cause me to need it. There's also sentimental and historically significant to you and your family. And these are a little bit harder to identify because each family is unique, but you have some similarities usually between families, some of the big ones. So photos. We have a lot of photos these days, especially with electronic photos, our phones, we can just click, 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 and we get all these photos, but not every single one of them is sentimentally valuable. Your wedding photo, that might beat out a picture of you and your spouse or whoever just standing there having fun or doing something. So you want to identify the photos that are most important to you. You have scrapbooks, family Bibles and diaries. And there's things like letters. I have a lot of letters growing up. Before the email was a big thing, we didn't have the internet really, so we wrote letters. And I wrote them to my grandparents, my best friend, a cousin. I have all these letters, but the ones on the screen are the ones that are the most important to me. They are the ones that my grandmother received from her brother and my grandfather when they were in the war, World War II. Now, there may be some historical significance to researchers because my great uncle was a UDT. He was in the first class of UDT, which is the underwater demolition teams. So there might be some kind of historical thing there. And my grandfather, he repaired tanks, and during the D-Day, he was sitting in England on a ship because being with tanks, he was not going to be on the first group landing. And he wrote home to my grandmother, and I was looking for the D-Day letter time frame because D-Day was their 10th anniversary. I wanted to see what he wrote, and he wrote, if anything were to happen to me, my only regret is that I did not ask you to marry me within a month of meeting you. For me, that's very sentimental and just very sweet and reminds me of my grandparents in a good way. Some historians might say, oh, look, that's a hint that he's worried that something could happen. And there's also just a like for people to collect, historical societies to collect letters from that time period, but they have more sentimental value to us, so we'd save them. And again, home videos, you really want to be careful with your home videos, going back to the slide about disasters, because what format is your home videos in? Are they in? Are they on VHS? Are they on a format prior to that? Have you brought them to, migrated them to more current software, or not software, but more current hardware? Because you might have lost them if they haven't been migrated. So you really want to stay ahead of that migration there, or ahead of the changes. And the final group is records that have taken you a long time to create. And so it would require massive resources to reconstruct. If you are a patron of the archives, you likely have a lot of either genealogical research or personal research. It might be professional research, or it might be just an interest you have. And you have poured a lot of time, a lot of money into collecting records to help you document your research. If you were to lose it, it would be very heartbreaking to have to start over again. And, some people have researched their genealogy and they have lines way back to the 1600s or prior. Trying to reestablish that would be very hard. People have spent decades. So you don't want to lose decades of work. So those are also considered important records to save. And just an example, I have a page from my family, few generations back, so nobody living is on it. My mom does genealogy, and I know she has hers backed up as she has electronic and paper versions, and she would not be happy if she lost her genealogical records. So how do you protect your records? I mean, this is going to be kind of brief, at least briefer than everything else has been. This is another presentation. If you would want more information, just let us know. So the first thing to do in any kind of disaster plan is to identify what your records are that you want to protect. You don't need everything. You want to know what you want to protect. You also want to identify your potential hazards. Go through your house and look what could possibly be a danger to your records. If you have them in an attic, a basement, in a shed, or any locations that are not climate controlled, not secure, you want to move them out, because those are, they not only do not have climate control, they likely don't have very good pest control, and your records are likely to get damaged there through the heat, the humidity, and whatever. You want to know where your sources of water are, and again, not just where the plumbing is for sinks and all that, but what's in the attic, what are in the walls, because a leak could occur that you might not realize, again, that the pipe is just above it. So you want to make sure that you take care of that. You don't want to store them near windows or doors, because those can leak during a storm, or the sealant can come loose and disappear and things could come through. You want to store your records at least 6 inches off the ground, and that's just in case there's a small flood. They're not sitting on the ground. You want to keep them in acid-free containers. There's a difference between acid-free and archival records, or archival supplies. You would think they would be the same, but there are companies out there who say that their stuff is archival quality, and it's actually not. It's not acid-free, so really, really look into who you're buying from to make sure that they are truly acid-free. You would prefer to put them on metal shelving or wood shelving that has been coated in polyurethane, so that the acid from the wood does not get into your records. You can have fireproof containers. You also can have waterproof containers, but the fireproof containers are not heat-proof, so your records, you might have a fire and your records went through the fire okay, but the heat got too hot in the fireproof container and your records combusted that way. You want to manage your records. As I said, you have a lot of records in your house, and there's some people that can never get rid of anything. You can go find a receipt where they went and bought a soda from 15 years ago. You really want to know what records you have to have by legal requirements, audit requirements, IRS requirements. So talk to accountants, talk to lawyers, do your research, because the more you have to manage, the harder it is to keep those essential records safe and define them. So get rid of the, after consulting with the experts, get rid of those records you don't need. Also, especially if you have just a small area to put your records in, because you're shoving more in there than it should be shoved in there. You want multiple copies, multiple locations, multiple formats, and you want to keep them current. And these are for your essential records. That way, if something happens to the original, you still have a backup copy someplace. So say, for example, you have a family member, or a trusted friend who lives, not where you are. They live, a couple states away maybe, and you really trust them. You could store your records copies with them. And that way, if some disaster affected your area, maybe your records would make it safely through there. Having them on different formats, because if you're evacuating, say you're evacuating from a hurricane or fire or whatever, it's a lot easier to just grab a hard drive than trying to grab boxes of records. And also, if you're trying to save other things besides your records, which you likely are, a hard drive is not going to take up as much space. You want to keep them current because an old, out-of-date insurance policy isn't going to help you necessarily. I mean, if you have it, you don't even know who you're supposed to be contacting, you really want to make sure everything is current. You want to back up your records, and remember that backing up is not the same as a copy. You want to back up all the records, and a backup is you need certain software or a program to restore your records back into order, because they're not going to be stored in the same order as you see them on your server or on your computer. As I've said before, you want to make sure you migrate your records to new software or hardware before that software or hardware becomes obsolete or it degrades, so that you lose your records that way. You want to periodically check your records, and this is for any format. You want to check where your records are, make sure the area they are is not having any water problems, climate problems, pest problems, but you do want to check to make sure that they aren't having problems either. So you open them up, make sure there's nothing happening with them. With your electronic records, that you can still access them. And of course, you want to evacuate your essential records with you. One thing to note about protection and dealing with a disaster is your records are secondary to life, so don't spend time trying to find records and grabbing them. If you have a limited time and you don't know where your records are, you get out instead of risking your safety to find whatever you're looking for. And just a little side note, if you have a small fire, you might have a fire extinguisher that you can use, but they only have enough foam for like 25 seconds, so you can't have you have a very limited size fire you can put out, and if you can't put it out with that fire extinguisher, just get out. Don't bother, call 911 and get help. Know where your fire extinguishers are, and have them scattered throughout. Make sure they are fully charged. I have a little kitten here just to add kitten cuteness. She can see where the fire extinguisher is. Make sure your fire alarms are working. Change out the batteries every 6 months. Same thing with your carbon monoxide detectors, just to keep you safe. I'm not going to go into recovery because that is, again, a whole another area. But just know that records may not be lost if you act immediately. You might think, oh my goodness, they got soaking wet. There's no way to save them. You can possibly save them, but you have to respond immediately. If you have, for example, a computer that's soaking wet and sitting in water, don't take it out of the water. Leave it there. Call the experts. Know some salvage companies to contact. And here's some resources. Ready.gov is the Department of Homeland Security's website, and they have very helpful resources there. It talks about records as well as some other just disaster planning in general. There's FEMA's documentation about critical documents to have. And in closing, I just want to show you why we're talking about this. This is Pratt City, Alabama, which was hit by, I believe, by F5. I'm not sure, it might be an F4. But as you can see, if you're coming home to this and you don't have any records, where are you going to start? This is why you truly want to have your records. There was a tornado that hit a place in Texas maybe 15 years ago, and they showed the street where it hit, and all that was left was the foundations, the slabs. There was not even debris because everything had gotten picked up. So you really want to make sure, again, that you have your records off-site as well, copy off-site, so that you can, if your house is destroyed and you can't get your records there, you have them elsewhere. Thank you very much. If you have questions, because this is not live, you can email me and I should be able to help you. If it's legal wise, like how long I should keep something, you should keep something, I can't answer that because I'm not allowed to provide that advice, but I can provide other guidance. And thank you for watching.